Hello. Good evening. Everybody hear me okay? Too loud, too quiet? Good. Okay, good. I'm Angela Mettler. I'm an administrative assistant in the president's office at South Dakota Mines. Thank you guys for coming tonight. Thank you also to everyone who is attending virtually. This is Steam Cafe. We've been doing this since April of 2018. We couldn't do it without you. We are also thankful for the partnership with Hay Camp Brewing and South Dakota Public Broadcasting that puts this on every third Tuesday. So again, thank you for coming. At the end of tonight's presentation, there will be a question and answer session. Those of you who are attending virtually, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box or the Q&A section, and I will make sure they get answered. So, Dr. Van Nuys, take it away.
Okay. Check, check, check. All right. Can you hear that? Okay. So far, so good. Thanks for coming. I'm Frank Van Nuys, and I've been teaching history at the School of Mines for 20 years now. Thankfully, I don't do equipment. Well, it's pretty good shape. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. So I want to thank everybody also for coming tonight. Thank Angela and Dane and the whole Steam Cafe operation. And say hi to the people in Zoom land, or as I sometimes called them when we did this for classes, the Zoompa Loompas. Let's get started. So what is this? Ultimately, this talk will be in published form as a chapter in a series of a collection of historical history essays that the Center for Western Studies at Augustana University is going to be publishing at the end of next year in December of 2023. And so just in terms of background of where this information comes from, the historical research, the rigor I put into this. About a year ago, I did the research junket South Dakota version, which included, well, actually, first of all, spent a fair amount of pandemic time at home doing online research because happily, if you're fascinated with history of South Dakota politics, want to get into the legislative manuals and the journals of the House and the Senate and the session laws and all the governor's messages, South Dakota State Library has all of the stuff online. That was really helpful to just be able to jump in from home and look those things up, at least as part of my sort of research agenda. South Dakota State Archives in Pierre was part of kind of the on-site research behind this project, and got to sort of go back to kind of the old school microfilm newspaper research, which some of you might remember and enjoying at some point in your lives as well. And then the Peter Norbeck papers themselves are held at USD USD Archives and Special Collections down in Vermillion. I went there in May of 2021. Made an appointment, thankfully, it turned out they were getting ready, just as we are at Devereaux Library, to gut the whole library and remodel it. So the archives were getting ready to move out to another site. So I couldn't work in the reading room. So they stuck me in a closet across the way. So I looked at Norbeck's papers, scrolled away in this little closet for a couple of days. So let's get into what we're referring to in terms of the age of Norbeck. 1910s and 1920s, one of the, perhaps the preeminent political figure of his generation. Born near Vermilion, farming family. Father, I think, was also a minister. Old as a young man, he gets involved in the artesian well drilling business. Turned out to be a very lucrative business for Norbeck. Eventually moved to Redfield, and by the time he sort of made his fortune, he was able to sort of leave the business in other family members' hands and move into politics. So he, as you can see here, serves in the state senate, first elected in 1908, and makes a steady progression from lieutenant governor to governor for 2 terms, and then to the U.S. Senate for the remainder of his life and his political career. He is what we in the history business call Rooseveltian progressive Republican. So a lot of his principles are kind of aligned with Theodore Roosevelt. Conservation, of course, we associate Roosevelt with conservation. And that's the larger reason why he is on Mount Rushmore. For this period, early 20th century, those of you who have some familiarity with the history of the conservation movement of those generations. You think about Roosevelt, of course, with Gifford Pinchot as kind of the avatar of the sort of more pragmatic conservation for use approach, which I would align Norbeck with that primarily, and John Muir, the more sort of spiritual, mystical, poetic preservationist variety. The motivations, trying to figure out exactly what inspired Norbeck to become so heavily invested in conservation politics and policymaking, is somewhat elusive. His main biographer, Gilbert H. Fite, in Prairie Statesman, which was first published in the late 1940s, basically said, well, it's there, but it's really hard to pinpoint any sort of clearly articulated vision for Norbeck. But there is, in the 1930s, there's an interview he does with American Forestry magazine, and he talks about his Scandinavian background, his Swedish father, Norwegian mother, having come from beautiful parts of Scandinavia, and that sort of is built into his upbringing. And of course, he's a well driller, he spends a lot of time outdoors, but his conservation ethos is more political and pragmatic than it is poetic. That's how I would describe Norbeck in terms of that philosophy. Part of the subtitle to my talk is Conserving, Protecting, and Improving, which I think really capture pretty clearly that Rooseveltian Pinchot style conservation for use philosophy. And I pulled that phrase from an interesting article document which appeared in a 1939 publication called South Dakota 50 Years of Progress. It was a commemorative publication with a series of different essays by a lot of luminaries celebrating South Dakota's 50th year of statehood. And Carl Munt, some of you may have heard of, also had just been elected to his first term as one of South Dakota's then 3 congressmen. And had been on the had been a member of the State Game and Fish Commission, wrote this essay on our conservation policies. This is 3 years or so after Norbeck and Silver. So, blessed by Mother Nature, with wealth of natural resources, South Dakota stands second to no other state. A bit hyperbolic. In the Union today, it's programmed for conserving, protecting, and improving the great outdoor assets, which make it a hospitable and happy place in which to live and a magnet for tourists from throughout America. And what stands out to me there is, of course, natural resources and outdoor assets what does that actually mean? Well, there's kind of a talk about this transition that I think Norbeck helps facilitate from sort of more traditional economic motivate or economic foundations of conservation. It's all about mineral industries, it's about agriculture, it's about conservation for use. What stands out to me is that magnet for tourists. If this had been somebody writing the for a publication celebrating the 25th anniversary of statehood, I don't think that phrase would have been used in 1914. But it's a different era, and this is building on Norbeck's work in sort of realizing the importance of automobile-based tourism, on the scenic and recreational amenities that needed to be added to sort of more traditional economic types of conservation impulses. So that's what that phrase refers to. And let's talk about this, what's going on in South Dakota's politics of nature while Norbeck is kind of at the height of his powers. Norbeck and his allies were supportive of depoliticizing and professionalizing administration of game and fish politics. Sounds pretty exciting, right? But that's an important direction an important changes taking place in these decades to try to get the administration of these policies out of the hands of political hacks at the county level, which have been kind of a tradition. Uncle Joe, he can be he's the county game warden because he knows people and they know people, and he can do this. But it's inefficient from the progressive conservationist point of view. Efficiency and administrative excellence can't be handled at that level. They need to centralize things. You need professionals who are not beholden politically to manage the resources well. Advancing protection of wildlife in Custer State Park, first of all, and refuges, advocating for creating additional parks and recreation areas. Now this is the age of Norbeck, but he's not alone. There are a lot of very sort of significant allies of his, and I'll just reference a few. There's a guy named John A. Stanley, who was the editor of the Lead Call and works with Norbeck through much of this period as a fellow member of the Custer State Park Board. John R. Boland, who is a Republican political figure here in Rapid City. The state game wardens, of course, particularly a guy named Oscar Johnson. There's a dentist, a wound socket named Dr. H.E. Fankhauser, who works pretty closely with Norbeck as one of his sort of supporters and allies and facilitating policymaking. And then you also have the Isaac Walton League, which some of you may have heard of. And it was a pretty strong, probably the strongest state level conservation organization in this period, and the various state divisions of this Isaac Walton. So that's what they want, but it's going to be kind of a slog because there is resistance to these kinds of changes to conservation policymaking, particularly kind of shifting toward this idea that people want to take hikes or go to beaches or look at things are just as important to conservation policymaking as mining or timber or agriculture. So spending concerns. Why are we spending money on keeping bison alive in Custer State Park? That's going to be an argument some make, particularly if they're not in the western part of the state. Skepticism about the value of outdoor amenities. Why do we need to support, enhance these types of values you say are important? We don't see it. Not everybody in the state legislature understood the value for the extrinsic value of these outdoor activities. And then you're sort of dealing with traditional ideas rooted in a rural work ethic. And we'll demonstrate, so I'll show you some examples, particularly in the 1920s debates over expanding, creating new state parks, where many farmers and their political representatives and peers are incredulous about having recreational opportunities. But this is just invitation to idleness, and it's going to ruin an already very stressed agricultural economy. The 1920s agriculture in South Dakota is on the verge of ruin pretty much the entire decade. The divisions that are revealed in researching this period, of course, normal partisan ones are Democrats and Republicans that are squabbling, but also the intra-party, particularly the inter-party divisions in the Republican Party are really important here. Norbeck is with the progressives, but there's a conservative wing as well. And then the East River, West River differences, those are still very pronounced. And farmers that were work ethic often find themselves at odds, as they sometimes still do, with sportsmen, hunters traveling around on their property, just as much of a contentious issue then as it still is today. And the recreations, people want to simply enjoy the outdoors for its own sake, and that kind of rubs up against that work ethic I referred to a moment ago. Now, conservation in the more traditional sense, early 20th century, is primarily associated with economic development. And in 1908, kind of on the heels of President Roosevelt holding this first of what were called governors' conferences in Washington, D.C., to discuss and construct sort of a national conservation movement and coordinate it at the national level. Gifford Pinchot, the first forester of the United States, is a key figure in developing these conferences as well. And the governor, progressive Republican governor of South Dakota, Co. Crawford, was inspired to create a state commission on state conservation in 1908. And then a couple of years later, you have the first of what would be a series of 5 conservation and development congresses. The first one takes place in Pierre in 1910. I didn't know about these, kind of surprised when I found sort of an obscure little folder in the state archives about with some photocopies of newspaper articles publicized. This was done in 1910. But the emphasis is primarily on agricultural conservation. So we're talking about irrigation and dry farming mostly. And at least in the first few years of these conferences, there are no sessions about tourists or automobiles. There are some, like, let's make the roads better, there's some of that, but haven't quite made that connection yet, but it's coming. And there's also some tensions, at least in 1910, some of the Black Hills delegates are taking advantage or taking the opportunity to complain about the federal government's overweening control of the forests, or the forest lands of Black Hills. So right, there's continuity, things that often go, it's always changing. It's not until the 1914 Congress that there's some sessions devoted to things like tourists, or suggesting that there might be something beyond just the traditional economic concerns that we see in those days. So Norbeck's role here, and I know he attends at least one of these. I know from his looking at his files, there's a letter he's talking about going to Sioux Falls in 1912 and going to these conferences. But he doesn't seem to be playing a particularly large role in them. But my main point, as I transition to sort of the core of this talk, is prior to 1940, South Dakota's politics and policy making was often linked to conservation. South Dakota spent much of their time living and working outdoors, so the appeal of the conservationist ethos was a natural orientation. It was a conservationist impulse, for the most part, strongly tied to support for agricultural and industrial growth, a pragmatic or utilitarian strain typically associated with Theodore Roosevelt early 20th century. Progressive conservationists in the Roosevelt mode maintained that responsible stewardship of the nation's resources would ensure their beneficial use for generations. Irrigation, dam building, timber cutting, mining, and other economic development processes were seen as necessary positive catalysts to maintaining the nation's capitalist system. Wise and efficient scientific management of natural resources would ensure sustainability and guarantee Americans can enjoy abundance indefinitely. That's what these conferences are primarily in that mold, sort of the conservationist ethos of Roosevelt and Pinchot and people like that. Now, Norbeck's significance, I think, has to do with, I think he's a little bit ahead of the curve in relation to some other of his South Dakota contemporaries in seeing that there's more to be done here. And a particularly significant element of his contributions, I think, lies in the growing emphasis that he helps place on activities without overt attachments to traditional economic development. With the rapid advances of America's industrial economy and burgeoning middle classes in the first decades of the century, conservationists increasingly added recreational and scenic opportunities provided by fishing, hunting, and automobile-based tourism to the agenda. So, background. All know Custer State Park, we know it, we love it. I have some sense of its long history and its significance. 1905, and if you want to read about this, it's kind of a good summary of this in Sam Hurst's book on Earl Brocklesby, rattlesnakes under his hat. First chapter, he talks about Peter Norbeck and two other guys taking off on a 1905 Cadillac from Redfield, driving a pier fairly easily, and then from ferrying across Missouri, and then driving to the Black Hills. The first people to do that, to drive to the Black Hills from the eastern half of the state. And there are no roads, cattle trails, that's it. They make it, and then he takes a train back a roundabout way to Redfield. But that is where apparently Norbeck starts developing this vision of the Black Hills as a integral lure to visitors, and that this is going to be kind of the next big thing. So as he's concerned with, he goes to what the area that becomes Custer State Park, is sort of alarmed at how little wildlife there seems to be. And that we're dealing with depletion of native wildlife. So in 1913, when he's still in the state senate, he introduces this game preserve bill, which becomes it's established on the legislation, this game preserve in the property that becomes Custer State Park, and it's also established as a state game and fish commission. And the Game and Fish Commission would be constituted by the governor, the attorney general, and the state game warden. What establishing the game preserve and the commission demonstrated were the priorities of centralizing state authority over game laws in the interest of efficiency and accountability. Progressive Republicans, progressive Democrats, this is something they're very much into. And the growing realization of an increasingly mobile, Midwestern, middle-class public intent on recreation, something he had sort of started to figure out in that 1905 trip. And then in 1919, of course, you have to come the more formal creation of Custer State Park by the legislature and a Custer State Park Board, whose job is basically going to be to hire staff, acquire title to school lands, which are still within parts of the Custer State Park, and also negotiate to buy other property still in private hands within or adjacent to the park boundaries. There's some pushback from some of the ranchers, particularly those that are either in or near the park boundaries, and they're going to have to be convinced to sell. There's pushback from East River, people saying this is a waste of money, waste of time. Nobody's really going to want to take a train ride or drive out and see these hills are not that great. So it takes Norbeck some years to kind of continue to keep convincing both halves of the state that the game preserve / state park is a worthwhile endeavor. But of course he does. And in the 1920s, as you might know, the legislature adds 30,000 acres of additional property to becomes the Custer State Game Park Sanctuary. Silver Lake and Needles and the Hardy Peak, Black Elk Peak areas are added. So in all this, particularly when he's governor, he has more leverage to effectively put these policies in place and create the state park. Now, 1920 gets elected to U.S. Senate. So Mr. Norbeck goes to Washington. What's interesting is he is still intensely invested in continuing to support additional policy in advancing Custer State Park and other conservation issues. And the interesting thing is, when he goes to Washington in 1921, congressional sessions then sometimes did not meet until even 13 months after election. I guess elected 1921 session was fairly normal, spring into fall. But for instance, 1922, an off-year election, after those elections, 1924 also, Congress did not meet in regular session until the December of the following year. Then they might go to Washington to do committee work, but it's not as full-time an endeavor as we kind of assume now. It's not till the 20th Amendment, which comes into force in 1935, that you now have the inauguration of the presidents in January, and Congress begins its first session, third day of January. For that, it was they weren't there that long, so that gives him time to sort of linger and loom over legislative sessions and appear in January through March. Consistently, Norbeck is there. He's lobbying, he's watching from the balcony, he's keeping an eye on things, he's writing more bills for Custer State Park, he's writing other bills for his legislative allies, deeply involved in the budgeting, the expansion ideas for the park, wildlife additions, even wants to try to get moose in there at one point. Private landowner holdouts, negotiating all the hard negotiations that try to get them out of the park. It takes years to do that. Now, in 1924, Carl Gunderson was elected governor. And the 1925 legislative session, and Gunderson and Norbeck are same party, but they represent the two factions, progressives versus conservatives, and they have sort of personal and political differences. And Gunderson's administration actually reorganized government to the extent that they actually eliminated the Game, Fish, and Parks Department in 1925, and they eliminated the Game and Fish Commission in 1925, and they replaced that administration with a director of the Division of Fish and Game within the Department of Agriculture. And that irked Norbeck, and these were his babies. And Gunderson was able to get the legislature to get rid of those in the apparent interest of efficiency. Now, in 1926, Gunderson was attempting to run for re-election. Norbeck remained neutral, but it was clear he was intent on not helping Gunderson win re-election. So he was working behind the scenes. He always make sure I'm in the background. Don't tell people I'm up to these things. But he is encouraging editors in 1926 to push back against Gunderson's assertions of an East-West division that militated against Custer State Park and sort of the whole idea of conservation that Norbeck was so committed to. So, as an example, in a letter that Norbeck wrote to the editor of the Watertown Public Opinion, he's referring to Gunderson and says he's tried to raise a sectional issue by saying that a large part of the money spent in the Black Hills State Park came from east of the Missouri River, in the belief that the larger number of taxpayers east of the river will sustain it. So Norbeck's coaching newspaper editors to counter Governor Gunderson's attacks, quote, along the line that the Custer State Park is a state park, that unfortunately the mountains line the western part of the state instead of the central part, but they nevertheless are in South Dakota. So when Gunderson reads this in a few of the papers, he will not be so cocksure of himself. And as it turns out, Gunderson, because of there's economic distress in the 1920s in the agriculture and timber and mining industries especially. And you also have agricultural depression, financial disasters taking place, the GOP divisions, but Gunderson is very unpopular, kind of a prickly character. So you wind up with the first Democrat to be elected the governor of the state of South Dakota, William J. Buelow. And Buelow finds himself kind of surprised they won, but there he is. He's going to take office in November 1926. He gets elected, and he's immediately receiving letters from Norbeck offering unsolicited advice on how to proceed in terms of certainly conservation policies. Norbeck urges him to reestablish Game and Fish and Park the Game and Fish Commission, and provide it with its own funding authority, which Gunnarsson's administration had taken away their independence. Now, Buelow and the Democrats, who did not win a majority, they did not take the legislature. Probably still had like a 1 vote or just barely over a 2/3 majority in the House, and still controlled the Senate. But there's an impasse. Buelow and the Democrats wanted to control the funds to remain the Secretary of Agriculture. And they're worried about the composition of the new Game and Fish Commission would be, well, might have a Democratic governor at Buelow, but you'd have 2 other Republicans on that 3-man commission. They'd be overwhelmed by the Republicans. This is all part of a larger battle in 1927 between Buelow and the Republican-controlled legislature over spending. Buelow is a Jeffersonian, small government, low budget Democrat. And for him, the Republicans have to watch out for in terms of their spending priorities. So long story short, there's an impasse. Actually, Buelow wound up vetoing the appropriations bill the Republican-controlled legislature passed in 1926. So there's no appropriation in 1927, excuse me. So then they have to have a joint session in June of 1927 to try to resolve that. So simultaneous with Calvin Coolidge coming out to the Black Hills and hanging out in Custer State Park too. So the impasse is resolved in the special session in June of 27, and it includes creation of a 6-member bipartisan Game and Fish Commission. This is kind of comes out of nowhere, but it had been an idea floated by a member of the legislature. Maybe we ought to have a nonpartisan commission instead. And that might alleviate some of the concerns that Buelow Democrats have. And they actually get it through. Now, Buelow actually did not support this legislation, but he did not veto it. He let it pass without his signature. So you wind up with a bipartisan Game Fish Commission, 3 members, 3 from each party by statute, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, only 2, no more than 2 from any of the then 3 U.S. House districts. And then no fewer than 1 member from each of those districts had to be engaged in farming. So that constituency would be represented. And funding authority was restored to the Department of Game and Fish. Kind of a big turnaround, a triumph, really, for Norbeck working behind the scenes to recreate his administrative structure for what he hoped to be this idea of a depoliticized, efficient, centralized conservation administration. Okay, another question. You have Custer State Park, 1919. 10 years of growing and sort of demonstrating the viability of the idea of such a property or such an idea. And you get the late 1920s, a lot of other states, particularly neighboring states, are in a boom period of creating parks and coming up with administrative systems of state park systems. This is happening in the Midwest and nationwide. And Norbeck's working behind the scenes, of course, but he's concerned about diminishing natural recreational scenic areas being lost to privatization and commercial development. So there are some properties out there on lakes, rivers, sort of wild areas that if they are not protected, become part of an expanded state park system, then they're going to be lost. Now his focus, as we go on to 1929, is we need to sell people in the southeastern quarter of the state and the northeastern quarter that they need parks too. Automobile tourism was emerging as the key rationale. And there was an assumption because you had a state gas tax, that if you could convince enough people in the legislature and in the public to expand the number of state parks, they'll pay for themselves essentially because all those tourists coming from Minnesota and Iowa, Nebraska, and elsewhere will be paying gas tax to fund it. That was the theory. They bear most of the financial burden. And Norbeck appreciated the tourist angle, and he also appreciated that we needed to be patient here. So in one of his communications, he says, "I'm painfully aware of the fact the people do not share my enthusiasm for parks. And I plugged along for a dozen years in the Black Hills Park because before I was able to convert the Black Hills people to the idea. In fact, they never became converted until the tourists came along and spent their money. I'm wondering whether it'd be more difficult or easier to stir up some interest in the eastern section of the state, where parks are so far more important to the population than Black Hills, where a park is found in every section. So 1927, legislature authorized the Custer State Park Board, of which Norbeck is still a member, and a special legislative park survey commission to do a study, report on where the state might establish new parks for the legislation to consider and hopefully approve and come up with some sort of funding mechanism for these new parks. Reports come out during the legislative session. A park bill is constructed rather hastily, kind of late. It passes the Senate pretty easily and then hits a wall in the State House. And the objections were coming primarily from economy-minded farmers and their representatives in the legislature, as well as some sportsmen who were convinced that the game fund would be raided to pay for state parks. There were 5 new parks proposed in the 1929 bill. One was Oakwood Lakes, which is north of Volga in Brookings County, a lake region, kind of the northeastern corner, glacial lakes up there, Ruskin, which is in Sanborn County, Armadale Island, which is between Redfield and Aberdeen, and Big Stone Lake up in the northwestern eastern corner near Millbank. And in the debate, Norbeck's allies in the legislature saying, listen, this will pay for itself. Tourists are going to pay gas tax. This is coming. Automobiles, the way of the future. Let's go. But opponents, primarily representatives representing some of the sort of primary farming sectors, are talking about this is a blank check and irresponsible. And one of the biggest jokes ever perpetrated on the farmers of this state, according to one of the legislators. And one of the most, what I thought was the more unique angles to the opposition to the 1929 State Parks Bill came from the legislator named R.R. Buchanan. Is that your battery? One up there. I'll just keep going. He came from Ipswich. And Pure Capital Journal reported on this today, and this is what caught my attention was, trouble is farmers spend too much time now chasing around the country. Now, driving across the country, you can tell by the looks of fields whether a man is staying home and taking care of business, or is chasing around the country to recreation places. The fields are showing black and will be a short crop of the ones where the farmer is not attending to his business. And that attitude sort of carried the day in the House, and so that the bill doesn't get through. But Norbeck, rather than being irked and dismissive or contemptuous of that kind of rhetoric, understood. This is going to take time. We have to be patient, and we can hardly expect a man who's handled the plow all his life to enthuse over a state park. They, and he's talking about the Farmers Union, which was the lobbying organization for farmers in the state. They had to be against something, and this was a convenient object. That, I think, they reflected the views of their members has been hit hard hit the last 10 years. The agricultural depression, that rural work ethic, for the incongruity in many farmers' minds of who in their right mind is going to, should be only the worst farmers are going to leave their farms and go take a hike or go to the lake or recreate. It's irresponsible. It's not it's a bad thing to do. So he's trying to explain this to some of his allies who are frustrated at the failure of this bill in 1929. So insofar as consolidating administrative authority for game and fish management, solidifying the popularity and viability of Custer State Park, beginning to massage public opinion on creating additional state parks. The state's conservationists have made great strides up to this point. 1929, 1930, Norbeck's accomplishments, I think, are kind of speaking for themselves. Now, to tie things up, 1931, there's another attempt to put together a state park bill. And in his post-mortem after 1929, Norbeck basically said, we tried to do too much. Suggesting 4 or 5 new parks is just way more. We should have kept it down to 1 or 2, but I'd have no control over that. And that's probably why it went down to 2s. And you still have the same scenario, 31, Senate approves it, the House rejects the state park system bill. And that's the last time it's ever introduced in the state legislature. 1932, you have your second Democratic governor elected, Tom Berry. He'd been a member of the Custer State Park Board, an ally of Norbeck. And again, Norbeck is offering a lot of advice and encouragement to Berry to try to sustain the momentum here. In a letter to Berry a little bit before he was governor, he says, my first interest is in the Custer State Park, second in the Badlands, which they're trying to create, turn into a national park, and third in the park possibilities, the eastern part of the state. Got to keep working on expanding the state park system. They're all necessary, they're all important. We'll get farther by working together. 1935, the Custer State Park Board is kind of reorganized, eventually gets renamed the South Dakota Park Board, expanded, I think, from 3 to 5 members. So that is one of those loose ends that sort of ties itself up. But of course, we're still in the midst of the Great Depression, World War II. So there's very little accomplished in terms of creating more state parks until after the war. 1945, Norbeck is now gone, the Department of Game, Fish, and Parks is created, and now it's overseen by an 8-member bipartisan Game, Fish, and Parks Commission. That's still in place. You have to have 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. And you still have to have at least 1 or maybe 2 members have to be engaged in farming. So it's basically an expansion of that earlier idea of the 6-member bipartisan Game and Fish Commission. So, South Dakota conservation succeeded in shifting toward more recreational and scenic amenities as a core element of their policies, creating, strengthening, and depoliticizing. Take that maybe with a grain of salt. The administrative structure of conservation management and bipartisan Game, Fish, and Parks Department. And kind of before I open up for questions, I'll revert back to the Carl Munt chapter in that publication, 1939. Where he really, and that's in 1939, so still a 6-member bipartisan commission, but he has really emphasized this was a big deal. This is nationally envied and nationally copied. I don't know if that was true, but sort of presenting South Dakota as a vanguard, a leader in sort of nonpartisan or bipartisan professional conservation policymaking. Now, what was sort of peculiar in Munt's article in 1939 was he didn't mention Norbeck. And I know there's no personal problem between them. Munt had been on the Game, Fish, and Parks, Game and Fish Commission. They're not enemies, but he sort of inadvertently leaves them out of this ode to conservation policymaking in South Dakota, which was rather peculiar. But that aside, there's no way around Norbeck as a central personality linked to conservation in South Dakota's first half-century statehood. Still, conservation politics in the state during these formative decades was certainly about more than one man and demonstrated a surprising level of unpredictability and fluidity. In the end, the achievements of Norbeck-era conservationists have endured and evolved. Farmers, their lobbying groups, and political representatives no longer express disapproval for taking some time off to relax by a lake or take a hike. Hunting and fishing, while declining in popularity in aggregate terms nationally, remain relatively popular and lucrative in South Dakota. The state park system now boasts 13 parks, most of them east of the Missouri River, plus dozens of recreation and nature areas, as well as a historic trail in the Black Hills. Millions of visitors from around the globe clamber all over the hills, spill out into the Badlands and beyond. fulfilling in large measure the early conservationists' anticipation for exploiting the state's scenic and recreational resources. Thank you. Hopefully I left enough time for questions. I'm glad to see the good turnout here tonight too. Yes.
So I've seen pictures like from the late 1800s and early 1900s, and Black Hills didn't have that many trees. When he started the park movement, did we have a Black Hills National Forest then, or did Ed come in?
Yeah, right. A good example, like you looked, for instance, you look at the Illingsworth photos, the Custer's expedition in 1874. There are definitely not as robust a forest canopy, you might say, in a lot of parts because of the sort of natural effects of fires that have been basically unregulated before white settlement. The Black Hills National Forest is established in the 1890s, I think in 91, 92, as part of President Cleveland or Harris, I think, sets up the first forest reserves, and it's one of the first significant national forest reserves. It's kind of expansion in the 1890s. And the different Pinchot, the first national forester, used the Black Hills as often as kind of a study model for how to manage and expand, develop cycle forestry.
So, the other things that are happening in the world at the time that Peter Norbeck is accomplishing these things make it seem really unlikely that he could get that much stuff. He was governor during World War I, elected to the Senate when the Great Depression started with the codes, plans, really in the 20s. 1929 was, that's the stock market crash, and a lot of people date the depression to that, but it happened earlier.
Right.
Here, times were hard.
Yeah.
I think it's fairly amazing that the things that he did accomplish in the, those conservation, progressive style.
Yeah.
All of that seems to made it nearly impossible for anybody to accomplish what was done.
Also, particularly in relation to budget and convincing, and that was one of the more difficult challenges, I think, in terms of Custer State Park. It actually passed with a pretty significant majorities in 1992. But there was still that element in the political culture itself that was reluctant to see this as a value that you should spend taxpayer money on advocating a small corner of the state to the detriment of the people. And it's especially hard to sell when you have the agricultural sector struggling away in the 1920s, banks failing. And so, but he was a really skillful, savvy, pragmatic political operator. And what struck me in looking at his correspondence and his papers with William was this largely behind the scenes, I don't know what I call it, puppeteering necessarily, but making sure, let's get our message out. Come on, we give this speech. We need to push back against some of these ideas that are arguing for that these are wastes of time, that these are not worthy of devoting some taxpayer funds to sustain.
So you mentioned just now, like a lot of this work was kind of in the background. Do you find like roughly what time period he really became known for the work, or both locally and more nationally?
Well, I think in South Dakota, he's pushing, he does, the Custer State Park bill in 1913, that's him. And he's the main driver. So that certainly raised his profile. And he became a star in the Republican Progressive Faction Republican Party rapidly. I mean, he's in that Crawford, Henry Vesey pool of Republican governors who are supportive of these types of, it's more state activism to some extent. I mean, Norbeck also is the one who come up with the idea for the state cement plant. As a way to, and I think there's a connection there. Okay, if we're gonna bring in tourists, they have to have roads. So rather than get gouged by private interests in terms of highway materials, let's just have the state do that. Which of course, for some was just a shocking drift into socialism. But in some cases, economically, he sometimes goes in that direction. But he's I think, kind of in a public spirited mode that this is not, this is about something large. And I think he's always able to kind of see, he seems to be consistent, able to see sort of the larger picture, right?
So at the time, did the rest of the country try to recognize his ideals?
Well, not until he gets to the Senate. And in the Senate, he plays a large role in the Migratory Bird Treaty and Migratory Bird Act in the late 20s, I think. And he's kind of known as a conservation politician, and a lot of other folks don't want anything to do with that. So they let Norbeck sort of take over that part of the agenda.
What was the most recently created state park? Are we still creating them?
There's 13. I don't know what the most recently created one. I don't know if there's been a major state park created for a while.
Yeah, this one right at the edge of Sioux Falls.
Oh, yeah.
Blood Run. I think
Blood
it's
Run,
called.
yeah, I think that was in the last 10 or 15 years, yeah, I guess that would probably be a Blood Run.
To follow up somewhat degree from that standpoint, because of the populist and progressive era that Norbeck found himself in at that point, it's a real juxtaposition where you find the progressive, or not so much the progressive, but the populist feel in South Dakota at that period, but yet the anti portion that existed in the eastern part of the state. And then it evolved to the point that, not to make a point, but Tom Berry is the only governor in South Dakota ever from West River. And it came to the point, but to go back to Norbeck, how did he push through? Did he draw to the populist point that existed, say, and you had the populists that were the Robert LaFalls,
Yeah.
who represented the populist during that.
Yeah, and that's like the LaFollette type of progressivism would be a direction Norbeck would have
Right.
held his nose at. That's for him, that would have been, those are basically socialists. But he does have, I think there's a populist strain in his background. He identified very strongly with farmers. And I think that's why he was so patient in seeing many sort of farmer representatives in the legislature be so sort of unwilling to, for instance, vote in favor of more state parks. Because he understood those communities. And he'd always been very powerful as an advocate of farmers. So there's a populist Norbeck, there's a conservative Norbeck, there's a progressive Norbeck, there's even kind of a socialistic Norbeck at times. I think he's an exemplar of the pragmatic politician.
So was it the socialist Norbeck that established the cement plant?
Yeah. But you contextualize it, and I think it's thinking kind of in terms of what's going to help the people of South Dakota the most, what's going to advance a variety of constituencies' concerns, what's going to make
Pragmatism.
it's pragmatism. Yeah. So it's a pragmatic socialism, if you want to put it that way, or kind of an economic willingness to involve the state in certain economic functions, that will advance the public interest and raise, raise everybody's opportunities, I suppose.
What role did Norbeck play in some way house?
Oh, boy, I don't know if I have a really solid grasp on that, but he is certainly one of the South Dakota politicians that is lending a hand to making sure. I mean, it's Norbeck probably that's most influential in saying, Black Hills, Custer State Park, that'd be a good place for a president to hang out. William Buelow was also, of course, intimately involved with that because he's a Democrat like Wilson, or like, oh, excuse me, Wilson. Scratch that, I don't know what I'm talking about. But Buelow, he's the governor. And so I know the two of them are pretty intimately connected. A lot of Rapid City or West River politicians and editors and business leaders are pretty involved and well in getting, encouraging the summer White House experience.
So which amendment is it that established popular election of senators?
For senatorial population of senators, it would be, that's right, 17th, I think.
Okay, and so passed after he was,
Right, he was popularly elected. So the first popular elections of senators would have been after, let's see, I think that is 1913, perhaps is when that is ratified. So 1914 would have been the first time senators are elected by popular vote.
so every office he was elected to was popular, like
Yes.
legislature.
Yes.
Lieutenant governor, governor, senators never elected by
No.
legislature. So
Is there somebody else over here before you over there? Yes.
You mentioned earlier that he passed away while he was still in office.
Yes.
Was he still advocating these policies at a level? And
Yes.
if so what was his, what was he working on?
Well, I think the last few years of Norbeck's political career, as I understand it, his health was declining for those last 5 or 6 years. And his influence begins to wane as well. When Barry and the Democrats take control of state government in the 1932 elections, that's kind of indicative. It's a little bit harder for him to, because Barry appointed a Custer State Park superintendent, which always annoyed Norbeck, is that according to him, the Custer State Park Board was supposed to hire the superintendents, but all these governors kept doing it instead. So there was some sort of politics involved in that, and I think Barry put in a guy that just basically ignored Norbeck, because Norbeck's always meddling in Custer State Park management. Sometimes with agreeably, and sometimes just like, forget it, just ignore him. That's what he does. And he was on the Custer State Park Board till he died. But his ability to maneuver things from behind the scenes diminishes significantly in the 1930s. Yeah.
As far as pragmatic, was he also leading the charge to get highways built, make sure the rest of us?
Yes. Yeah. Cement plant is tied to that agenda of trying to continue improving the roads. And for this idea of tourism in the 20s, we kind of think of it as national, international marketing, right? For Norbeck and that generation, it's mostly, there's a bunch of Midwesterners that need stuff to do, need something to see on the way to Yellowstone, and we have the opportunity to provide that with them. Midwesterners, middle-class Midwesterners in cars. That's the focal point of those early tourism efforts. I don't know to what extent he was, if at all, directly involved in developing that, but my guess would be he probably stuck his nose in at some point, and at least advocated for it and pushed for more funding than accepted. I'm just kind of guessing, I'm not sure. Any other questions? Angela, you may return.
There weren't any outlines.
Okay. What's wrong with it?
Thanks again, everybody, for coming. We do this every third Tuesday, so next month, the third Tuesday is July 19th. And the presentation is going to be about the CNAM Bio Center at South Dakota Mines, presented by Dr. Tammy Goebel and Donald Decker, who is a high school teacher at Nuys High School. They're going to be talking about how they have studied how microbes break down agricultural waste like corn stalks, soybean stalks, and turning it into bioplastics for use in agriculture. So it should be pretty interesting. Hope to see you on July, what did I say? July 19th.
Almost got through with just the battery power.
Yeah,
Every once in a
yeah,
while I can
not
get away
bad.
with it, but I must have turned it on a little too early. Yep.